Thank you for coming and hanging out with me this beautiful Saturday morning. My name is Lauren Luz, and the title of my talk is Why DAOs Will Change the World. So to get started, I want to define how the world is today from an economic perspective, basically by kind of talking about private goods versus public goods. So you guys are all probably familiar with this, but I'll go over it a little bit. Private goods are excludable goods and services that we have in society. They're the pay-to-play, ticket-to-entry kinds of goods and services. These are things like food, clothing, housing, laptops, computers, anything that you need to pay for in order to access. The private goods in our society benefit from being scarce because that enables these supply and demand dynamics that we have in capitalism that allow people to coordinate so effectively to innovate and create better and better private goods. Basically, because you can profit from making good private goods, people are driven to coordinate super effectively to innovate and make better private goods. It's funded basically by supply and demand dynamics. Public goods, however, are non-excludable. They're not pay-to-play. Anybody can access them. They're completely open and non-rivalrous. So these are abundant things in society that are often provided by governments and nonprofits. Things like infrastructure, roads, public safety, clean air, public education, in some countries, public health care. These are things that anybody can access for free because they're provided for them. The disadvantage of public goods, however, though, is because there's no profit in it, there's not a lot of opportunity to innovate. There's no people coordinating super effectively to innovate in the public goods sector. It's more of this kind of like charity gift sort of thing. They're funded mostly by taxes when they're provided by governments, or by charity, by donations when they're given by nonprofits. So without effective systems for feedback and innovation in the public goods sector, we're setting ourselves up for failure. We can say that the government is going to take care of the environment, but the reality of our situation is that governments are only responsible for taking care of the environment within their own jurisdiction. If there's a river that's being filled with plastic and that river is flowing outside of the region that the government is responsible for, suddenly it's not their problem anymore. It becomes a global problem. And who is taking care of this? Who's taking care of plastics in our oceans? We're taught that the world looks like this. But in reality, it looks like this. We're all connected, and we're all part of these systems, and we need to address global concerns. So when governments fail to provide public goods that are in demand, people start nonprofits. Nonprofits are the ones who are rising up and saying, I will take care of these environmental causes. But the disadvantage of the nonprofit sector is that nonprofits are super heavily dependent on donations. Please, donor, may I have some more? There's this kind of like need to raise funds and accept charity in order to have any funding in order to do any good work to add this value, this non-excludable value to society. And what ends up happening as well in these dynamics is that in order to keep and retain donors, nonprofits end up having to kind of bend to the wishes of what their donors want in order to maintain this donor retention. So we have even ineffective systems around nonprofits who are providing this non-excludable value that we need in society. You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. So the opportunity we have here in Web3 is to make a new model around public goods that replaces these inefficient systems around nonprofits and around governments providing public goods, that we can actually have a chance to change the world for the better. So the solution that I'm proposing here today are impact DAOs. So impact DAOs are bottom-up, constantly evolving, purpose-driven coordination network. They are decentralized organizations around a cause who are taking into account the feedback of a variety of stakeholders and often as well have their own regenerative funding streams. So we'll talk a lot more about impact DAOs, and I'll kind of talk about the pathway of basically turning nonprofits and empowering them with this Web3 technology to turn them into impact DAOs. In order to do this, I'm going to walk through all of these steps, so we'll get into them a lot more in detail during this talk. The first step would be to identify the stakeholders. Who are the people who should have influence over a particular public good? Step 2 is distributing reputation. To what capacity should each of those stakeholders have influence? Step 3 is implement voting systems. Implement systems so that these organizations are able to coordinate in a decentralized way around how funds should be allocated and around how decisions should be made. And then step 4 is launch regenerative economies to actually bring in these sustainable funding streams. So I'll be talking about a case study in this example, basically just to kind of like illustrate how this process will work. And I'll be talking about a nonprofit. This is a real nonprofit called the Ocean Cleanup. They're a nonprofit who's focused on taking plastic out of the oceans. They've figured out that 80% of the plastic in our oceans is currently coming from only 1,000 rivers worldwide. And this nonprofit has built these boats, they're called interceptors, to basically clean up plastic that is in these rivers and bring the plastics on board, and then they sort it and they recycle it. It's a super, super cool project. And and they're funded primarily by donations. So if we're talking about this nonprofit, step 1 in their transformation to become an impact DAO would be identify stakeholders. And I think the easiest way to separate this voice distribution process is via these 4 categories of stakeholders. One are who are the people who are doing the work, the people who are doing either volunteers or paid contributors who are doing the labor. In the case of this ocean cleanup project, these would be the people who are operating the boats, the interceptor operators. The second category are relevant experts, who are people in the field that are experts on what that nonprofit or what that public goods project is doing, who can provide valuable input. So this could be people like stream ecologists who study the biodiversity in rivers around the world. They would have valuable input on like the design of these boats and actually like how they should be operated. The next category are beneficiaries, and maybe beneficiaries isn't the right word, but these are the people who are being affected by the public good project. So in the case of this interceptor project, it would be people who are living alongside the rivers, like in Jakarta, Indonesia, where they're doing a lot of work. The fourth category of stakeholders are capital providers, and this is the one that we often think of in nonprofits. The primary stakeholder in most nonprofits today are donors. Those people should also still have an influence. What we need to do is kind of divide up influence among these different categories. So in traditional stakeholder analysis, you kind of want to map the entire field of stakeholders, talk about what capacity they have influence, whether they're positive or negative stakeholders, what durations of time do they have influence, and then kind of maneuver the project in order to balance those different needs. The opportunity we have in Web3, however, is that we can actually decide what influence each stakeholder should have by distributing tokens, by distributing reputation. So that's step 2. Step 2 is distributing reputation tokens to this field of stakeholders. And I'll talk about a variety of ways in which a nonprofit could do this. The first one is the most obvious one, is an initial distribution via an airdrop. So before you're introducing actual money, actual transferable tokens into the mix, I think a nonprofit DAO should use non-transferable reputation tokens, but can airdrop this to their community of existing stakeholders who are already adding value. Another advantage of an airdrop is that it builds hype around a project. It attracts those stakeholders into what the impact the project is doing so that they're paying attention again. But we also need systems for continued distribution. Over the life cycle of a project, the influence of different stakeholders will change. You'll have new contributors coming in, you'll have old contributors dropping out, so we need strategies in order to address those general pathways. So I'll use one example here, something that we do at Giveth. It's token distribution, where basically we distribute reputation tokens to our contributors every quarter, and every quarter we give them more tokens according to the Fibonacci sequence. So Q1, everyone gets 1. Q2, everyone who's eligible gets 2. Q3, everyone who's eligible gets 3. Q4, everyone who's eligible gets 5. So a contributor who came in Q4 would get 5 tokens, and a contributor who was only around in Q1 and then left and dropped out would only have 1 token. So they would be very quickly diluted by new contributors who are active and present and have the valuable feedback on that organization at that time. We also need to consider a variety of other contributions and like how stakeholders are getting involved. The easiest one, of course, is quantitative contributions. We can give reputation tokens to people who are providing capital. We can also track other quantifiable data. And there's tools like Karma, which actually transforms data like the length of forum posts, on and off-chain votes, GitHub contributions into tokens. And this is just like one way that you can kind of determine how much how many reputation tokens to give a person based on, in the case of like the Interceptor project, like how much time they are spending operating the boat. But we also need to consider qualitative contributions. These are rewards where someone goes above and beyond, and they didn't just put in money, they didn't just put in time, but they did something exceptional. This is where systems like Praise comes in. Praise is a product developed by General Magic and the Common Stack and used heavily at Giveth, where basically written peer recognition is then quantified, given a score, and turned into tokens. So in the case of the Interceptor project, there could be people working their regular shift, and then someone notices that the engine is overheating on the boat. And then they fix that engine, so it ended up that the project was able to continue and there wasn't like serious mechanical problems with the ship. And this would be something that would be worthy of praise. It's something that goes above and beyond just their regular working hours and actually is worth something even more. We also need to consider the level of impact a person has on a project. So this is like talking about experts, those people who are experts in a field who should have influence that maybe aren't directly involved in the project right away, but maybe are writing papers on stream ecology or writing papers on plastic in our oceans. Those people should be given reputation tokens as well. So a way of distributing tokens to them is perhaps via award ceremonies where you can recognize excellence in the field. And then this one is one of the ones I think is important, is the level of impact the project has on a person. The stakeholder is often completely neglected. So these are like people who are living along the rivers in Jakarta. We need to consider the positive and negative implications of a project like the Ocean Cleanup Project operating in rivers next to their homes. How do we give these people power? And in the case of, I mean, if you look at the conditions of the people who are living in here, it's probably not likely that they're looking at forum posts and hanging out on their computer and claiming tokens all the time. So this is where we end up needing things like representative governance, people who are paying attention to the needs of those stakeholders and then voting on their behalf or communicating back and forth with those communities. We need to have that stakeholder input as well. So once we've kind of like mapped this whole field of stakeholders and distributed tokens, reputation tokens, then we're ready for that impact DAO to start governing in a decentralized way. So there's a lot of really basic ways for governing on-chain. One is snapshot. We use this at Giveth all the time, where you have basic yes, no, on-chain voting using tokens, or quadratic voting, ranked choice voting. Probably many of you are already familiar with this style of voting. This is useful and effective, but it also requires people to be pouring through those long forum posts, understanding all of these complicated governance things, and wrapping their head around it. So what I'm more interested in is tools that are actually using signal aggregation to kind of track how people are voting without people needing to understand every part of the system. So here's just one example of a project that's working in that direction. This is Pairwise. And the way that Pairwise works is it basically gives you two options. You're like, do you want to do the Interceptor trash fence, or do you think the Interceptor barrier is a better idea? And then the person who's interacting with Pairwise chooses one, and then they get another two options. And they choose the best of those two options. Then they get another two options and choose the best of those. And Pairwise aggregates all this data and can say which was the top preferred proposal, which was the second and third, and so forth. So tools like this are actually getting closer to real signal aggregation. You don't need to understand every single component. You just need to know which of these two options you think is better. And there's also like abstain and skip. So tools like this are really, really valuable, and I think are kind of the future of decentralized governance, especially when we're considering this diverse set of stakeholders in a nonprofit DAO. The last step is, of course, after identifying stakeholders, distributing reputation, effectively governing as a DAO, is to introduce regenerative economics. This is where you introduce market feedback into the public goods sector, basically by launching a transferable token or creating a money system around the nonprofit DAO. So I don't have a ton of time to talk about this here, but Tam's giving a talk later, and John Elliston from Refi DAO is giving a talk later, and they're going to be talking a lot about regenerative economics. But the main point I want you to understand here is that regenerative economics brings market feedback into the public goods sector so that we can actually have sustainable funding and innovation. Kind of like a lot to wrap your head around, but basically it's like creating an economy around a cause so people can buy into it, and there can be market feedback. There can be supply and demand dynamics that determine which projects are successful and drive people to innovate in that sector. I think this is hugely important and a major step in the future. And what we're doing with this at Giveth is it's called GIVe's. And if you're interested in that, come talk to me later, talk to Griff later. It's a hot topic. But one point I do want to get across in this talk is that once a DAO is moving to this stage and ready to launch transferable tokens, they don't need to get rid of the non-transferable reputation system. And I actually think that this is totally critical. You don't want to just replace the reputation with money, essentially, because then suddenly contributors who are working part of that organization are getting paid in these tokens that they need to sell in order to pay for their life. But they should still be able to keep their reputation because their influence is extremely important. So if we have a mix of transferable and non-transferable tokens, then we can actually have distributed stakeholder input that people aren't losing over time. Capital contributors can buy in and have one type of token and vote with that, and people who are contributing their time can have a different type of token that still has the same level of influence in the DAO. So anyway, it's a lot to take in, but if we were able to succeed in transforming nonprofits and impact DAOs, how would the world change? Well, instead of having public goods education systems where children are just expected to fall in line according to our systems, we could actually have innovative education systems where each student's unique learning style is targeted and supported and nourished and allowed to grow, systems like the Waldorf communities that currently exist. In healthcare, instead of having it primarily funded by pharmaceutical companies and just pharmaceuticals being prescribed for absolutely every ailment, we could have a combination. We could have holistic health solutions being used in combination with pharmaceuticals in order to provide the best supportive healthcare for any individual's needs. And then if we're successful with things like this, we can actually start to pull things from the private sector and bring it to the public sector. Imagine if private goods, like food, became public goods. We had such abundant community gardens that instead of needing to go to the market, instead of needing to pay to play to meet your basic needs, you could actually just be part of a community where food is a public good. Imagine if lodging became a public good. Imagine if we had systems where instead of people needing to build tent cities in the streets of Denver and be kicked out once in a while by cops, we could actually just provide them housing. Then people would be able to focus on their spiritual growth or the things that they're passionate about, be able to focus on their self-actualization. We would have world domination. A world where people are really able to focus on the things that drive them instead of just focusing on their base needs in this system of capitalism we're currently a part of. So this is what we're working towards at Giveth. We have this pathway where basically we're pulling nonprofits into the Web3 space, and over time we want to empower them with this technology and help them on the path to become impact DAOs. Oops. And the Common Stack is working on the research side of it. They're using collaborative economics methodology, cultural frameworks, a library of tools, and research, and basically combining this information so that we have great systems that are easy for people to understand so that they can launch their own economies and own commons. The bottom line is that by empowering nonprofits to become impact DAOs, we can foster community-led, economically sustainable, innovative public goods creation and can build a world of abundance that everyone can enjoy. My name is Lauren Luz. I'm at Karmatic Acid on Twitter, and this is why DAOs can change the world. Thank you. Oh, great. I can take 2 questions. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
Hi. So the question would be, how would you coordinate basically public good infrastructure builders to build a infrastructures that are compatible with each other?
Infrastructures
compatible. That are compatible with each other. That can work together.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is like a huge opportunity. If we're able to create like DAOs with their own economies around public goods, we could actually have competing organizations, and then we can have the market determine which ones are adding the most value. We could have the people who are the end users of public goods to be able to provide that feedback. So then you would have It's like right now in public goods, everyone's just like working blind, doing the best that they can because they're dependent on these donations and they only have one stakeholder input. But if we actually are able to add in a variety of stakeholders and open it up to the market so that like the people who are using the public goods can provide their feedback in real time, then we can actually have these organizations coordinating. We create Schelling points around public goods that currently we don't have in society. Any other questions?
Yeah, just curious to see if there's any regions in the world which are really kind of taking this forward and saying, hey, we're a nonprofit and we're now using Web3 to, get donation streams, and actually we're going to start doing this on the ground in our communities. Are there any geographies that come to mind that are using Giveth today?
Well, I mean, it's funny that you're... I'm like, the climate community, it seems like all the work that the refi space are doing, it's like a lot of climate projects are really interested in getting in this Web3 world. And we saw that a lot in like the Gitcoin Alpha round, that there was this entire round of climate projects who are working super hard to start using and understanding this tech. And I think that like, it's like the climate community seems like the first one that's on the path to really using these tools in an effective way. And then even just like working through it, because right now it's like in this learning growth phase where we're like still working out like the best way to really launch a DAO. But the climate community is like interested in doing that work and bringing it closer so that any nonprofit could use it worldwide. Okay, those were my 2 questions. Thank you so much.